On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. 3.3 million German soldiers, 750,000 vehicles, 500 tanks, advancing across a 1,600-mile front. The largest military invasion in human history. The objective: crush the Soviet Union in 6 weeks. Maybe 8. Hitler was confident. His generals were confident. The world expected the Soviet Union to collapse by autumn. Instead, what followed was the deadliest conflict in human history. 27 million Soviet deaths, entire nations annihilated, civilizations erased, and somehow, against all odds, the Soviet Union survived. The expectation asterisk: every military expert in 1941 believed Germany would win. The Soviet army was in chaos. Stalin had purged his officer corps, executing thousands of experienced generals in 1937 to 1938, the Great Purge. The remaining leadership was inexperienced, traumatized, terrified of making decisions that might anger Stalin. Soviet equipment was outdated. Soviet tactics were primitive. Soviet morale was shattered. Germany, by contrast, was the most advanced military power on Earth. German tanks were superior. German strategy was proven. They'd conquered France in 6 weeks. German soldiers were well-trained, well-equipped, well-led. The math seemed simple. Germany would win, easily. The first weeks seemed to confirm expectations. German forces advanced 300 miles in the first month. Soviet armies were surrounded, destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were captured. In some battles, the Soviets lost 300,000 soldiers in a matter of days. Entire armies ceased to exist. The German advance was so rapid that supply lines couldn't keep up. But it didn't matter. The Soviets seemed to be collapsing anyway. Yet by autumn 1941, the Soviet Union was still fighting. Not winning, but not defeated. The Germans reached the gates of Moscow, but couldn't take the city. Winter came. German soldiers, equipped for a 6-week campaign, froze in temperatures they'd never experienced. By December 1941, the invasion had stalled, and everyone realized this wasn't going to be a quick war. How did the Soviet Union survive? Multiple factors. 1. Space. The sheer vastness of Russia meant Germany couldn't conquer it fast enough. 2. Resilience. Despite the purges, enough Soviet officers remained to organize resistance. 3. Industrial capacity. Soviet factories kept producing weapons, tanks, ammunition. 4. Winter. German equipment failed in sub-zero temperatures. 5. Supply lines. Germany couldn't supply an army across 1,600 miles of hostile territory. 6. Stalin's will. No matter how many soldiers died, Stalin kept fighting. But most importantly, the Soviet Union had something Germany didn't: time. The largest urban battle in history. Brutal, savage, house-to-house fighting. For 6 months, Soviets and Germans killed each other in the streets. When it ended, the Germans were defeated, not just at Stalingrad, but the myth of German invincibility was shattered. After Stalingrad, the momentum shifted. Soviet armies began pushing westward. By 1943, the Soviets were winning battles. By 1944, the Soviets were advancing across Eastern Europe. By 1945, Soviet armies were in Germany. Germany had lost. The Soviet Union had won. The Soviet Union paid an unimaginable price. 27 million deaths, nearly 14% of the Soviet population. Entire cities were destroyed. Agricultural regions were devastated. Families were annihilated. By the end of the war, the Soviet Union was exhausted, traumatized, damaged in ways that would take decades to recover from. But it had survived. Hitler's goal was to destroy the Soviet Union quickly and completely. He believed German superiority made this inevitable. That he was wrong. The war he expected to win in 6 weeks lasted 4 years. The Soviet Union he expected to crush not only survived, it defeated him. And in doing so, it changed the world. How did the Soviet Union survive? How did an army in chaos, led by traumatized officers, equipped with inferior weapons, defend against the world's greatest military power? And what if Germany had won? What would the world look like? In 1937, Stalin made a decision that nearly destroyed the Soviet Union. He ordered the execution of his own officer corps. Thousands of the most experienced military commanders in the world were arrested, tortured, and executed. not because they were disloyal, but because Stalin was paranoid. The paranoia asterisk. Stalin believed there was a vast conspiracy against him. Hidden enemies, infiltrators, traitors waiting to betray him. These enemies, he believed, were everywhere. In the government, in the military, in the Communist Party itself. Most of it was fantasy, but Stalin believed it absolutely. The triggers asterisk. The paranoia intensified after a series of events. 1. Kirov's assassination, 1930. A popular Leningrad official was murdered. Stalin blamed a conspiracy. 2. Show trials, 1936 to 1938. Stalin orchestrated public trials where high-ranking officials confessed to fantastical conspiracies, usually under torture. 3. Reports of spies, Soviet secret police, NKVD, reported finding traitor everywhere. Most reports were fabricated. Officers under torture confessed to crimes they didn't commit. But Stalin believed them all. The military purges asterisk. In 1937 to 1938, Stalin ordered the liquidation of Soviet military leadership. The Soviet Union lost its most experienced leadership. Officers who'd fought in the Russian Civil War. Military theorists who understood modern warfare. Strategists who'd studied German tactics. By 1941, when Germany invaded, the Soviet military was led by officers promoted for loyalty, not competence. Commanders terrified of making decisions, fear of being accused of treason. Leadership without recent combat experience. A military that had just been decapitated. The specific victims asterisk. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, Soviet military theorist, expert in combined arms warfare, believed to be a genius tactician, executed in 1937. General Alexander Yegorov, Civil War veteran, experienced battlefield commander, executed in 1937. These weren't incompetent officers. They were the best the Soviet Union had. Torture, physical and psychological. Methods included sleep deprivation, beatings, threats against family members, psychological manipulation. After weeks or months of torture, officers would confess to anything. Plotting to overthrow Stalin, collaborating with Japan. Most of it was complete fabrication. But the confessions provided Stalin with the evidence he needed to justify the executions. The purges created a cascade of paranoia. If a commander had worked with an executed general, they were suspect. If they'd attended school with a traitor, they were suspect. If they expressed any independent opinion, they were suspect. Officers began avoiding each other, avoiding decisions, avoiding anything that might be misinterpreted as disloyalty. Leadership became paralyzed. Surviving officers lived in constant fear. Any day could bring arrest. Decision-making became incredibly difficult because any decision could be framed as treason. This atmosphere persisted well into the war. Even during Operation Barbarossa, when the Germans were invading, Soviet officers were still being arrested on charges of disloyalty. Imagine the United States executing its top 500 military officers in 1938 to 1939. The strategists who understood modern warfare. The leaders with combat experience. Then, in 1941, trying to fight Germany with the remaining officers. That's essentially what Stalin did. Why did Stalin do this? Theories. 1. Genuine paranoia. He actually believed in the conspiracies. 2. Political consolidation, eliminating potential rivals. 3. Ideological purification, removing bourgeois military thinking. 4. Some combination of the above. Most historians believe it was genuine paranoia combined with political motivation. Stalin was terrified of being overthrown. The purges were his way of eliminating potential threats. He killed the very officers most capable of launching a coup. But in doing so, he nearly destroyed his own military's capability to fight. What's remarkable? The Soviet military recovered. Soviet strategy became more sophisticated than German strategy. Soviet combined arms operations outmaneuvered German forces. How? Through experience in actual combat. Commanders learned by doing. The surviving officers, promoted after the purges, gained experience fighting the Germans. They became skilled generals through necessity. New officers were promoted rapidly during the war. Georgy Zhukov became the most successful general in the entire war. Superior strategist, better at combined arms than the Germans. Ivan Konyev, another brilliant tactician. developed strategies that outmaneuvered German forces. Alexander Vasilevsky, military theorist who helped develop Soviet victory strategies. These men emerged from the chaos, not because they were ideologically pure, but because they were capable and survived long enough to prove it. If Tukhachevsky had survived, he would have been a brilliant military strategist against the Germans. If Yegorov had lived, the Soviet military would have had experienced leadership. But they were dead, executed by Stalin's paranoia. The Soviet Union won the war despite losing its best officers to purges, not because of superior strategy, but because of superior numbers and willingness to endure casualties. The industrial question: can the Soviet Union survive without its Western industrial regions? Germany controls Ukraine, grain-producing region; Western Russia, coal and metal; Baltic states, resources; major industrial centers. The Soviet Union loses access to 40% of its industrial capacity. Can it survive with reduced production? The evacuation effort. Stalin makes a critical decision: evacuate Soviet industry. Factories are dismantled. Equipment is loaded onto trains. Workers are transported eastward to the Urals, Siberia, Central Asia. Over 1,300 factories are evacuated. Millions of workers are moved. The effort is chaotic. Many factories are damaged or destroyed in transit, but enough survive to continue Soviet production. The winter preparation. By autumn 1941, Germany realizes victory won't come in 6 weeks. The invasion will extend into winter. But German equipment is designed for summer. Tanks use the wrong oil, it freezes. Guns jam. Soldiers lack winter clothing. Stalin, meanwhile, prepares for winter. Soviet soldiers are equipped with winter uniforms. Tanks use winter-grade oil. This seemingly small advantage becomes critical. The supply line crisis. Germany's supply lines stretch 1,600 miles from Germany to the front. Supply lines are attacked by Soviet partisans, disrupted by poor roads, stretched beyond capacity. German soldiers receive insufficient food, insufficient ammunition, insufficient fuel. Meanwhile, Soviet supply lines, though also stressed, are shorter. Soviet soldiers receive better supplies. The morale collapse. By autumn 1941, German soldiers are exhausted. They've been fighting for months. They expected the war to be over. Instead, winter is coming. The Soviets are still fighting. The war might last years. Morale drops. Desertion rates increase. Soldiers question whether victory is possible. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers are fighting for survival. They have no choice but to fight. Paradoxically, the Soviets, despite catastrophic losses, maintain higher morale because they're fighting for their homeland. The Stalin factor. Stalin initially wanted to surrender or negotiate, but Hitler demanded unconditional Soviet surrender, demanded the elimination of the Soviet state. Stalin realized there is no negotiation. It's victory or annihilation. This clarity steals Soviet determination. Soldiers fight harder when they know defeat means death anyway. The partisan warfare. As Germans advance deeper into Soviet territory, they occupy hostile populations. Soviet partisans behind German lines attack supply convoys, derail trains, sabotage infrastructure. This guerrilla warfare drains German resources, ties down troops, disrupts supplies. The Germans respond with brutal reprisals against civilian populations. This brutality hardens Soviet resistance. Hitler orders a final push to take the city. The assault fails. German soldiers, freezing and exhausted, cannot break Soviet defenses. For the first time, Germany has failed to achieve a major objective. German soldiers retreat from Moscow. The myth of German invincibility is shattered. The unexpected survival. By the end of 1941, the Soviet Union has not been conquered. It's been invaded, it's been damaged. It's suffered catastrophic losses. But it still exists, it still fights. It still has armies. Germany expected victory by August 1941. Instead, they face a two-front war. Japan joins the war in December, forcing Germany to worry about the Far East. Germany has failed its primary objective, and the Soviets, despite everything, have survived the first year. It was a city on the Volga River, industrial center, population around 600,000. German forces reached it in August 1942. Hitler ordered it captured. Stalin ordered it defended. What followed was the largest urban battle in human history. 6 months of fighting, nearly 2 million casualties. A battle that would decide the fate of the entire war. Controlling the city meant cutting Soviet supply lines, controlling the river, advancing toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, threatening Soviet communications. But militarily, the city itself wasn't essential. Germany could have bypassed it. Hitler ordered its capture for political reasons. The city was named after Stalin. Taking it would be a symbolic victory, a humiliation of the Soviet leader. The initial German assault asterisk. German forces entered the city in August 1942. Soviet defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, seemed outmatched. German strategy, overwhelming force. Encircle the city, crush the defenders. Soviet strategy, defend street by street, house by house. Inflict maximum casualties on the Germans. The urban nightmare asterisk. Urban warfare is the most brutal form of combat. In Stalingrad, soldiers fought in rubble-filled streets, destroyed buildings, sewers, factory floors, room to room. Tanks were less effective, streets were too narrow. Air superiority meant less, fighting was too close. Numerical advantage was reduced, defenders had natural fortifications. It became a battle of infantry. Machine guns, hand grenades, bayonets, asterisk asterisk the casualties asterisk asterisk. The numbers are staggering. Germans and their allies, 400,000 casualties. Soviets, 1.1 million casualties. Civilians, 40,000 deaths. In some days, 10,000 plus soldiers died. The death rate was higher than any other battle in human history. By November 1942, the battle's situation changed. Soviet forces had been preparing a massive counteroffensive, Operation Uranus. While Germans were focused on taking the city, Soviet armies encircled them from behind. Suddenly, the Germans found themselves surrounded. 250,000 German and Allied soldiers trapped in the city. German forces were cut off from supply lines. Resupply attempts failed. German aircraft couldn't bring enough food, ammunition, fuel. Soldiers began starving, running out of ammunition, freezing in the winter cold. Hitler ordered them to hold. No retreat, no surrender. The soldiers obeyed and died. By January 1943, the situation was hopeless. German Commander General Paulus was surrounded. Starving soldiers refused to continue fighting. On January 31st, 1943, Paulus surrendered. 91,000 German and Allied soldiers were captured. Most would die in Soviet captivity. Only a fraction would ever return home. Stalingrad was a turning point. Germany had never suffered a major defeat. Hitler's armies had seemed invincible. At Stalingrad, the myth was shattered. Germany could be defeated, German soldiers could be captured, German victories could be reversed. The Soviet victory came at a horrifying price. 1.1 million Soviet casualties for a city that wasn't strategically essential. But the victory proved something crucial. Germany could be beaten. Soviet soldiers had held against the world's greatest military power. And they'd won. After Stalingrad, momentum shifted. Soviet forces began advancing westward. Germany was on the defensive. The war, which seemed unwinnable for the Soviets in 1941, became winnable. For Germany, shock and demoralization. The invincibility myth was broken. For the Soviets, validation. Proof that they could defeat Germany. For the Allies, Britain and USA hope. Germany could be beaten, the war could be won. Stalingrad represented a shift in warfare. No longer were armies fighting for territory or resources. They were fighting for survival, for annihilation of the enemy. Civilians were targeted, entire cities were destroyed. Surrender was not an option. This was total war, war of extermination. After Stalingrad, neither side could negotiate. Germany had lost too much to accept defeat. The Soviet Union had suffered too much to accept anything less than complete victory. The war would continue until one side was completely destroyed. That point came at Stalingrad. After Stalingrad, the Soviet Union had momentum. But momentum doesn't automatically translate to victory. The Soviets still faced a professional German military, still faced the greatest challenge. The question, could Soviet leadership learn to fight better? Could they develop superior strategy to Germany's? The Kursk Offensive, July 1943. After Stalingrad, Germany tried a new offensive, Operation Citadel at Kursk. Germany planned to encircle and destroy Soviet armies in a salient bulge of territory. The strategy was sound. Theoretically, Germany could still win major battles. But the Soviets knew it was coming. Soviet intelligence infiltrated German planning. Learned the attack date, learned the strategy. The preparation asterisk. Soviet forces prepared for the German attack. They built defensive lines, multiple layers, anti-tank positions, minefields. They positioned reserves to counterattack. They prepared for exactly the battle Germany planned to fight. When Germany attacked, they attacked into a prepared defensive position. The battle asterisk. Germans attacked from north and south, trying to encircle Soviet forces. Soviet defenses held. German tanks attacked the minefields. Many were destroyed. Infantry couldn't break through prepared positions. After weeks of fighting, Germany abandoned the offensive. For the first time, Germany had launched an offensive and failed to achieve objectives. The Soviet counteroffensive asterisk. While Germans were attacking at Kursk, Soviet forces launched their own offensives elsewhere. Soviet generals, particularly Zhukov, orchestrated multiple simultaneous attacks. Germany couldn't defend everywhere. Soviet forces broke through. The command structure. Stalin, surprisingly, learned to trust his generals. He allowed generals, like Zhukov, to plan operations without Stalin's interference. This trust allowed better military planning, better coordination. Germany, by contrast, had Hitler, who increasingly based on ideology rather than strategy. He made military decisions. As the war progressed, German strategy deteriorated while Soviet strategy improved. The Zhukov factor. General Georgy Zhukov emerged as the war's greatest strategist. Zhukov understood how to coordinate multiple army groups, how to exploit weaknesses in German formations, how to concentrate force at decisive points, how to use reserves effectively, how to combine armor, infantry, and air power. Zhukov's strategies outmaneuvered German strategy. The tank advantage. By 1943, Soviet tank production exceeded German production. Soviet tanks weren't individually superior, but there were more of them. In 1943, the Soviets produced 15,000 tanks. Germany produced 3,000. By sheer numbers, Soviets could replace losses, Germans couldn't. The operational art. Soviet commanders developed a strategy called operational art. Instead of fighting isolated battles, they coordinated multiple armies across hundreds of miles. German strategy focused on tactical excellence, winning individual battles. Soviet strategy focused on operational strategy, winning campaigns. The Soviets' larger view proved superior. The infiltration tactics. Soviet forces developed new infantry tactics. Small units infiltrating enemy lines, using terrain to avoid defensive fire, attacking from unexpected directions, using combined arms, infantry plus armor plus air support. These tactics were more sophisticated than German static defense. The air power. By 1943, Soviet Air Force was growing stronger. Soviet aircraft, Yak fighters, Il-2 ground attack planes, were competitive with German aircraft. Soviet pilots were trained better, had better tactics. By 1944, Soviet air superiority was replacing German air superiority in many theaters. The officer improvement. Soviet officers were learning through combat experience. Unlike peacetime officers, many of whom were purged, wartime officers learned by doing. The best officers survived. The logistics innovation. The incompetent officers were Soviet forces developed better logistics. Killed or removed. Supply lines were more efficient, better organized, more resilient. Soviet armies could sustain operations longer, could advance further, could replace losses faster. The strategic initiative. By mid-1943, Soviets had strategic initiative. They decided where battles would be fought. When how? Germany was reactive, defending, trying to stop Soviet advances. Once Germany loses initiative in war, recovery is nearly impossible. The momentum factor. Soviet forces began advancing continuously. 1943. Advance westward. Soviet forces liberate Ukraine. Soviet forces advance into Germany. 1944. Soviet forces advance into Poland. Approach Berlin. Each advance was planned, coordinated, executed with growing sophistication. The confidence shift. By late 1943, Soviet soldiers believed they could win. This is crucial. Armies fight better when they believe in victory. German soldiers, by contrast, were increasingly demoralized. Losses were mounting, victories were rare. What was once a German invasion of the Soviet Union had become a Soviet invasion of Germany. What was once about Soviet survival had become about Soviet conquest. The numbers by 1944 asterisk. Soviet military strength. 6 million soldiers under arms. 13,000 tanks in production annually. Air force of thousands of aircraft. Artillery dominance. German military strength. 3 million soldiers in the east. 3,000 tanks in production annually. Air force increasingly grounded, fuel shortages. Defensive positions, not offensive capability. The balance had shifted decisively. The Poland offensive, January 1945. Soviet forces launched a massive offensive into Poland. German forces couldn't stop them. The offensive covered hundreds of miles in weeks. By February 1945, Soviet forces reached the Oder River, just 65 miles from Berlin. Soviet supply lines extended from the Soviet Union to Poland to Germany. Despite the distance, supplies got through. This was no accident. Soviet logistics had become incredibly efficient. The final Soviet offensive against Berlin. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, 0.150,000 artillery pieces. 6,000 tanks, against 300,000 German defenders, 1,400 tanks, defensive positions in urban terrain. Even with advantages, Berlin was hard to take. But Soviet forces surrounded the city, cut off supplies, compressed the perimeter. After 2 weeks, Berlin fell. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 7, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Soviet forces had advanced 1,600 miles from their defensive positions in 1941. Germany, 7 million deaths, mostly military. The Soviet sacrifice was nearly 4 times greater. But the Soviets had won. The Soviet victory wasn't just military. It was industrial. Soviet factories replaced losses faster than Germany too. Strategic. Soviet generals learned to outmaneuver German generals. 3. Demographic. Soviet population could sustain losses Germany couldn't. 4. Geographical. Soviet territory was vast enough to allow retreat and recovery. 5. Political. Stalin's will never wavered, however brutal the cost. The Soviet Union survived and won against odds that should have been impossible. A country invaded by the world's greatest military power, losing millions of soldiers, losing territory, losing industrial capacity. Yet it recovered, adapted, learned, and ultimately defeated the invader. How? Through resilience, through sacrifice, through learning from mistakes, and through sheer willpower, the refusal to surrender. The Soviet victory determined the post-war world. Soviet armies occupied Eastern Europe, established communist governments, became the dominant power in the region. The Cold War between the Soviet Union and the West originated from this victory. The world we live in today, with divided Europe, separate German states, until 1990, Eastern European communism, emerged from Soviet victory. If Germany had won at Barbarossa, Nazi Germany would control Europe, Soviet Union would be destroyed. Millions more would be murdered in Holocaust. Communism would be eliminated. World War II would have a completely different outcome. Hitler's thousand-year Reich would have begun. The Soviet Union won and changed the course of history. The Soviet soldiers who survived 1941 were transformed by the experience. In June 1941, they were retreating, demoralized, captured by hundreds of thousands. By 1945, they were conquerors, advancing into enemy territory, liberating and occupying Eastern Europe. What changed? The initial terror asterisk. In 1941, Soviet soldiers were terrified, not just of death, of capture. German treatment of Soviet prisoners was brutal. Starvation, execution, medical experimentation, deliberate extermination. Soviet soldiers knew this. Terror motivated soldiers to fight to the death rather than surrender. The transformation process asterisk. The shift happened gradually over 3 years. Resistance and hope. 1943, confidence and momentum. 1944, dominance and aggression. 1945, victory and liberation. The Stalingrad psychology asterisk. Stalingrad was the psychological turning point. Before Stalingrad, Soviets were losing. After Stalingrad, Soviets believed they could win. This shift in psychology was as important as the military shift. Soldiers who believe they can win fight differently. The revenge motivation asterisk. Soviet soldiers had witnessed villages destroyed, families murdered, atrocities committed by Germans, entire populations exterminated. This created a powerful motivation: revenge. Soviet soldiers advancing into Germany weren't just fighting an army. They were avenging their people. This intensity of motivation is difficult for Western soldiers to understand. They were fighting for abstract ideals like democracy. Soviet soldiers were fighting for something personal: the survival and vindication of their people. The brutality problem. As Soviet forces advanced into Germany, they committed atrocities. Rape, destruction. The Red Army's conduct in Germany was brutal, sometimes genocidal. German civilians suffered horrendously. Why did this happen? The answer is complex. 1. Revenge for German atrocities in the Soviet Union. 2. Lack of discipline. Officers permitted looting/violence. 3. Dehumanization of the enemy after years of brutal war. 4. Soviet soldiers' own experiences of violence and trauma. The officer's dilemma. Soviet officers faced a problem. To maintain discipline, they needed to control soldiers. To maintain morale, they couldn't punish soldiers harshly for looting or violence. The balance tipped toward permitting atrocities. The psychological scarring. Soviet soldiers were traumatized by the war. They'd witnessed millions of deaths, lived in constant danger, experienced deprivation. Many Soviet soldiers became hardened, emotionally numb, capable of violence without hesitation. Post-war, many struggled with what they'd done, what they'd seen. The purification fantasy. Stalin promoted a narrative. Soviet soldiers were liberating Europe from Nazi oppression. They were spreading communism, spreading Soviet influence. They were heroes, saviors. This narrative helped justify the brutality, made soldiers feel like they were doing something noble. But the reality was more complex. Soviet soldiers were both liberators, freeing people from Nazi rule, and occupiers, imposing Soviet rule and communist ideology. The confidence crisis. Paradoxically, as Soviet military confidence grew, Stalin's paranoia increased. He feared his generals were becoming too powerful, too independent. He feared soldiers who'd seen the West during liberation would want Western freedoms. He began purging officers even during the war. Not as extensively as the 1937 to 1938 purges, but enough to maintain terror. The ideological shift. Soviet propaganda shifted from defend the motherland against invasion, 1941, to spread communism across Europe, 1944 to 1945. This ideological shift justified expansion into Eastern Europe. Soviet soldiers were no longer just defending. They were conquering, spreading Soviet influence. The moral ambiguity. Soviet soldiers at wars and faced a moral ambiguity. They were heroes. They defeated Nazi Germany. They were occupiers. They were imposing Soviet rule. They were liberators. They freed people from Nazi oppression. They were oppressors. They imposed communist totalitarianism. This ambiguity remains in Russian consciousness today. The transformation complete. By May 1945, the psychological transformation was complete. Soviet soldiers went from defeated refugees to conquerors of Europe. They'd learned, adapted, overcome that they'd suffered unimaginable losses, and kept fighting. They'd transformed from an army in chaos to the world's most powerful military force at that moment. The long-term effects. The war's psychological impact lasted decades. Soviet veterans were treated as heroes, but also as potential threats. Stalin feared they'd been exposed to Western ideas, that they'd want freedoms. Soviet veterans who survived were often marginalized, not fully trusted. Some were even executed after the war. The trauma of the war and Stalin's paranoia scarred Soviet society for decades. The question that historians still debate: why didn't Germany win? By every rational measure, Germany should have conquered the Soviet Union in 1941. Germany had superior training, superior technology, superior strategy initially, surprise, initial advantage, numerical advantage initially. The Soviet Union had inferior training, inferior technology, chaotic leadership, shock from invasion, Purged officer corps. Recovered. 1. Why? Factor 1. Geography and space. The Soviet Union is vast, incomprehensibly vast. Germany couldn't conquer and hold 8 million square miles of territory with 3 million soldiers. The more Germany advanced, the longer supply lines became. Resources were stretched, German forces were scattered. Meanwhile, Soviet forces could retreat, fall back, regroup deeper in Soviet territory. Factor 2. Resilience and sacrifice. Soviet soldiers and civilians endured losses that would have broken other societies. 27 million deaths. Entire villages annihilated, families exterminated. Yet the war machine continued. Production continued, soldiers kept fighting. This willingness to endure impossible casualties gave the Soviets advantages no other nation could match. Factor 3. Industrial production. Once Soviet factories were evacuated and re-established, production exceeded expectations. Soviet workers produced more tanks, aircraft, ammunition than Germany. Germany could win battles, but couldn't replace losses. Soviets lost battles, but had reserves to replace losses. Factor 4. Time and winter. Germany planned a 6-week victory. They got a 4-year war. The longer the war lasted, the more Germany's advantages eroded. Time favored the numerically larger Soviet Union. Winter favored Soviet forces, equipped for cold, familiar with conditions. Time and weather were strategic advantages. Factor 5. Stalin's ruthlessness. Stalin's brutality, executing generals, purging officers, came with a cost. But it also ensured absolute obedience. No doubt that no hesitation. Soviet soldiers knew refusal to fight meant execution. So they fought. This ruthless compulsion to continue fighting was a form of strategic advantage, however morally abhorrent. Factor 6. Learning and adaptation. Soviet forces learned from defeats. Military tactics were analyzed, refined, improved. By 1943, Soviet strategy surpassed German strategy. Zhukov and other Soviet generals became superior tacticians. Learning from mistakes and adapting faster than the enemy is a fundamental advantage. Factor 7. Allied support. The United States provided Lend-Lease aid. Trucks, canned food, supplies, aircraft. This aid wasn't decisive militarily, but helped Soviet logistics. Without it, the Soviets would have been slightly more constrained. Factor 8. German mistakes. Hitler made critical errors. 1. Underestimating Soviet military capacity. 2. Overestimating German superiority. 3. Overextending supply lines. 4. Committing to Stalingrad, pointless siege. 5. Allowing Hitler to override military judgment. German generals made sound military decisions. Hitler overruled them with ideological decisions. This mismatch between military reality and Hitler's fantasy decisions became increasingly costly. Factor 9. The Two-Front War. Germany had to fight on multiple fronts. Eastern Front, Soviet Union. Western Front, after 1944, Allies. Mediterranean, Italy. North Africa, briefly. Resources couldn't be concentrated on defeating the Soviets. By 1944, Germany was fighting a defensive war on all fronts. Factor 10. The survival threshold. The Soviet Union only needed to survive, not defeat Germany militarily initially. By surviving long enough, Soviets outlasted Germany's 6-week invasion plan. Once the war extended past autumn, Germany was in trouble. Winter favored Soviets. Production favored Soviets. Time favored Soviets. Asterisk, asterisk, the counterfactual question, asterisk, asterisk. What if Germany had won? A successful Barbarossa in 1941 would have eliminated the Soviet Union, given Hitler control of Eastern Europe, provided resources for the Nazi regime, changed the outcome of World War II globally. The Allies, US and Britain, would have been fighting Germany and Japan without Soviet support. The war would have lasted longer. Casualties would have been higher. Germany's victory seemed possible. It was closer than many realize. But it didn't happen. Asterisk, asterisk, the lessons, asterisk, asterisk. The Soviet survival teaches lessons about 1. Resilience in adversity. Endure losses, keep fighting. 2. Learning from mistakes, adapt, improve, overcome. 3. Industrial capacity. Replacement of losses matters. 4. Geography. Vast territory provides strategic depth. 5. Time. Longer wars favor larger populations. 6. Willpower. Refusing to surrender even when defeat seems likely. It survived because it was willing to endure. To sacrifice. To adapt. It survived because it had space to retreat into. Time to reorganize. Capacity to rebuild. It survived because Germany made mistakes and the Soviets learned faster. Most of all, it survived because millions of Soviet soldiers refused to surrender. Even when defeat seemed inevitable, even when odds were terrible, they kept fighting, and eventually, they won. The modern relevance asterisk. In a world of nuclear weapons and potential civilizational collapse, the Soviet experience reminds us, nations can endure seemingly impossible odds. Resilience matters, adaptation matters, willpower matters, but so does the willingness to sacrifice, the willingness to endure, the willingness to see conflicts through to the end. The Soviet Union's survival against Nazi Germany is history's greatest example of a civilization facing annihilation and refusing to surrender.